So here's the situation. My name's Alex, I'm 24, and I recently got out of a 2.5-year relationship. It was my first serious relationship, and I have to admit, things were complicated from the start. Right now, I'm struggling with a question that's been eating at me. Am I the bad guy for deciding to block my ex? Let me explain. The breakup wasn't messy. In fact, it was surprisingly calm. We both agreed that we had fundamental differences that couldn't be ignored. But even though there's no lingering bitterness, I can't shake the feeling that keeping any connection with her would be wrong for me. At the same time, I wonder if blocking her makes me look immature or petty. This whole situation has me questioning my choices. Blocking someone might seem harsh, especially after a relatively peaceful breakup. Still, I feel like I need some space to move on fully. I'm not sure if this is a normal part of ending things, or if I'm being overly dramatic. Over the next few minutes, I'll share my story, from the highs and lows of our relationship to the decisions I'm facing now. My goal isn't to shift blame or paint myself as a victim. I just want to lay everything out as honestly as I can and let you decide. Am I the jerk in this situation? When we first met, everything felt so new and exciting. She was 27, a few years older than me, and I think that maturity, or what I thought was maturity, was part of what drew me to her. She had this confidence about her that made me feel safe, like she knew exactly who she was and what she wanted out of life. For someone like me in my early 20s and still figuring everything out, it was magnetic. Our differences were clear from the beginning, but I didn't see them as a problem. She came from a religious family, and while she said she didn't fully follow their beliefs, she still had faith in God. I, on the other hand, have always identified as agnostic. She had a strong personality, and I admired how passionate she was about her opinions, even when we didn't agree, like on politics. But in the glow of the relationship's early days, those differences felt small. They were quirks, not cracks. I was also drawn to her honesty. She didn't hide her past, including the fact that she'd had some pretty toxic relationships before me. She made me feel like I was different, like I could be the person who showed her what a healthy relationship looked like. I took that role seriously, maybe too seriously in hindsight. As time went on, I started noticing things that weren't as ideal as they had seemed at first. She didn't have a steady job at the start of our relationship, and while I didn't mind helping her out financially, it started to feel like I was taking on more responsibility than I should have. Still, I told myself it was temporary. Relationships are about supporting each other, right? Looking back, maybe I ignored some of the warning signs because I wanted the relationship to work so badly. After all, it was my first. It felt like something I needed to hold on to, no matter what. At the time, I thought love was supposed to be hard. As the months went on, those small differences that seemed so easy to brush off at the start started growing into major points of tension. It wasn't like everything fell apart overnight, but little by little, the cracks in our relationship became harder to ignore. Religion became one of the first real sticking points. While she insisted early on that her family's evangelical beliefs didn't define her, it became clear that faith was more important to her than she initially let on. She'd talk about missing church gatherings or how much she valued the traditions she grew up with. I didn't begrudge her those feelings, but I wasn't going to change my stance. I was always honest. Religion wasn't a part of my life, and I wasn't going to force myself to fit into that mold. Politics was another minefield. We didn't just have different views, we often had opposite ones. Casual debates would quickly spiral into full-blown arguments. Sometimes I wondered if we even listened to each other, or if we were both just trying to win. And then there was the question of the future. She'd say she didn't want kids, something we actually agreed on at first. But over time I noticed her hesitating more when the topic came up, dropping hints about what-if scenarios. It was confusing. Did she really mean what she'd said before, or was she starting to change her mind? Money became another constant source of tension. When we met, she wasn't working, but she eventually got a job about a year in. Even so, I was still covering a lot of the expenses. I didn't mind helping out. I wanted to support her, but I started to feel like I was carrying more than my share. It wasn't just financial either. Emotionally, I felt like I was always the one trying to hold us together. By the time these issues really started to pile up, I could feel the stress building between us. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything, all at once, chipping away at the relationship we'd tried so hard to maintain. Our relationship became a cycle of breaking up and getting back together. It's hard to explain why, but every time we decided to end things, it never stuck. Most of the time, the breakups would last a day, maybe two, before one of us reached out to talk again. The reasons for the breakups were always the same. We'd argue sometimes over big things like religion or politics, other times over smaller, everyday frustrations, and it would feel like we'd hit a wall. One of us would say, "Maybe we're just not meant to be together," and the other would reluctantly agree. But when the reality of being apart set in, neither of us could handle it. I think part of it was fear. For me, she was my first serious relationship, and the thought of letting go felt like failure. Maybe I thought that if I tried harder or compromised more, we could make it work. For her, I think it was the sense of safety I gave her. She'd told me more than once that I was different from the people she'd dated before, gentler, more understanding. I wanted to live up to that image, even when it came at the expense of my own boundaries. But every time we got back together, the issues didn't magically disappear. If anything, they became more pronounced. Our arguments became louder and more emotional, especially when the same unresolved topics came up. The constant push and pull drained us both, but we didn't know how to stop. There were moments of peace, though, times when we'd both commit to making things better and work harder to meet in the middle. But those moments were always temporary, like patches over deeper wounds we didn't know how to heal. Looking back, I think those repeated makeups gave us the illusion that we could fix what was broken. We convinced ourselves that love was enough, even when the evidence said otherwise. But deep down, I think we both knew we were delaying the inevitable. As the relationship grew more turbulent, I found myself turning to outside perspectives for clarity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally off, but I didn't trust my own judgment. So I did what many people do when they're confused. I went online. I posted about my situation on Reddit, hoping for advice from strangers. I laid it all out: the differences in religion and politics, the financial imbalance, the constant arguments. I even mentioned the fact that I felt more like a caretaker than a partner at times. I wasn't looking for validation. I wanted honesty. And honesty is exactly what I got. The responses were blunt. People told me I was being a pushover, that I was taking on responsibilities that shouldn't have been mine. Some said I was playing the role of a father figure in the relationship, not an equal partner. At first, it stung to hear that. I wanted to believe I was just being supportive, doing what anyone would do for someone they loved. But as I read through more comments, something clicked. They weren't wrong. I had been bending over backward to make the relationship work, often at the expense of my own needs and boundaries. I realized I was trying to fix things that weren't mine to fix. It wasn't just about money or emotional labor. It was about how much I was willing to sacrifice to keep the relationship alive, even when it was clear that we were incompatible. That advice marked a turning point for me. For the first time, I started to see the relationship from an outside perspective, and it made me question my role in the dynamic. Was I really helping her, or was I enabling behaviors that weren't healthy for either of us? And more importantly, was I being fair to myself? Those questions stayed with me, even as I continued to try and salvage what we had. The answers weren't easy to face, but they were the first step toward understanding what I needed to do for my own well-being. In the final months of our relationship, something began to shift. It wasn't a sudden change, but a quiet, creeping realization that we were both slowly pulling away from each other. Conversations that once felt intimate and full of potential started to feel distant, like we were rehearsing the end without actually saying the words. She started bringing up topics that felt like preludes to goodbye. For instance, she'd talk about how much she missed being part of her church community and how hard it was for her to reconcile our differences in faith. She mentioned wanting to be surrounded by people who shared her values, something she knew I couldn't offer. At the same time, she began dropping comments about children, how she might want them after all. even though we had always agreed that wasn't part of our future. These conversations felt loaded, like she was testing the waters to see how I'd react. I always gave her honest answers. I wasn't going to start going to church, and I didn't want kids. These weren't new positions, but hearing her talk about them so often made it clear that they were becoming deal breakers for her. It wasn't just her, though. I started pulling back too in my own way. I found myself less willing to engage in our arguments, choosing silence over the exhausting back and forth that never seemed to resolve anything. I began imagining a life without her, not out of anger, but because it felt like the only logical outcome. One of the most telling moments came when she told me our relationship had healed her. She said I'd shown her what love could be, especially after the trauma of her past relationships. While part of me felt proud to have been that person for her, another part felt a pang of sadness. It sounded like closure, like she'd already decided to move on. In those final weeks, it became clear that we were both preparing for the end, whether consciously or not. It wasn't a dramatic unraveling, but a slow, mutual understanding that our paths were no longer aligned. The final blow came over New Year's. For years, she had been insistent that we spend the holiday together. It was non-negotiable. In fact, one year, when I decided to celebrate with my family instead, it led to one of our worst arguments. She made it clear that being together during that time was important to her, so I adjusted my plans to prioritize our relationship. This year, though, something was different. We couldn't find a place to celebrate, and the idea of staying at home together seemed to lose its appeal for her. Out of nowhere, she told me she'd spend New Year's Eve at her church's family event instead. It wasn't just a casual decision, it was deliberate. She chose a setting that she knew didn't include me, one that I couldn't comfortably be part of even if I wanted to. I was stunned. For someone who had always been so adamant about us being together for this occasion, her sudden indifference felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just that she chose her church, it was the hypocrisy of it. She had once demanded that I put our relationship above everything else on this specific day, but now she didn't extend the same consideration to me. That night, we didn't argue. I didn't see the point. Instead, I sat with the realization that this was who we'd become. Two people so disconnected that even our traditions no longer mattered. A few days later, she called me to talk, and I already knew what was coming. She ended the relationship. Calmly, almost clinically, she said that our differences were too great. Religion, politics, future goals, everything we had fought over for years now felt like insurmountable barriers. She was right, of course. I had known it too for a long time. There was no yelling, no accusations. It was just over. For the first time in years, I felt something I didn't expect: relief. Despite the sadness, there was a weight lifted from my shoulders, and I knew it was time to let go. In the days following the breakup, I found myself in an unfamiliar emotional state. On one hand, I felt an undeniable sense of freedom, as if I'd been released from a cycle that had held me captive for far too long. On the other, there was this lingering uncertainty, a quiet voice asking, "Now what?" I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, dissecting her words and my own feelings. The breakup had been peaceful, almost too peaceful, and it left me wondering if that was why it felt so surreal. Could something that had caused so much chaos for years end without a fight? For the first time in what felt like forever, I started focusing on myself. I noticed small things: the extra time I had, the absence of constant tension, the way I no longer dreaded certain conversations. It was refreshing, but it also came with its own set of challenges. I had spent so much of our relationship trying to make things work that I'd lost touch with who I was outside of it. Now I had to figure that out all over again. At the same time, I wrestled with what to do about her. We hadn't fought, so there wasn't a clear reason to cut her off completely. Yet the idea of keeping her in my life felt wrong. I didn't want to risk reopening wounds or falling back into old patterns. Some mutual friends suggested that staying connected could help ease the transition, but I wasn't sure if I agreed. Every time her name popped up on my phone or I saw her posts online, it felt like a tether to a chapter I was trying to close. I didn't hate her, far from it, but I also didn't want her presence to keep me from fully moving on. That's when the idea of blocking her started creeping in. It wasn't about being cruel or petty. It was about creating the space I needed to heal. But even as I considered it, I couldn't shake the nagging question. Would it make me look immature? Would it make me the bad guy? The decision to block her wasn't one I made lightly. I kept going back and forth, weighing the pros and cons, trying to figure out what felt right. On the one hand, blocking her seemed like the easiest way to create a clean break. No notifications, no reminders, no temptations to check her social media during a weak moment. On the other hand, it felt drastic. Did I really need to go that far? I started questioning my own motives. Was I doing this to protect myself, or was I trying to make a statement? Blocking someone, especially after a calm breakup, can come across as dramatic or even vindictive, and I didn't want to send the wrong message. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about her. It was about me. I had spent so much of our relationship putting her needs above mine, bending and compromising to keep the peace. Now, for the first time, I had the chance to prioritize what I needed. And what I needed was space. Blocking her wasn't about punishing her or erasing the past. It was about giving myself the room to move forward without distractions. Of course, doubts still crept in. Was I overthinking this? Would she even notice or care? Part of me worried that blocking her might reignite old feelings of rejection or hurt for her, even if that wasn't my intention. But then, I remembered all the times I'd ignored my instincts during our relationship, all the times I'd put her comfort above my own. In the end, I realized that I couldn't make this decision based on how she might perceive it. I had to trust myself to do what was best for me, even if it felt uncomfortable. So, with a deep breath, I opened my phone, scrolled to her name, and hit block. It felt strange at first, like severing the last thread connecting us, but as the hours turned into days, I started to feel lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of her presence in my life. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, did I do the right thing, or was I taking the easy way out? Now that I've laid everything out, here I am, still questioning myself. Blocking her felt like the right thing to do for my own sanity, but part of me can't help but wonder if it was an overreaction. Was it really necessary? Was it selfish, or worse, was it cruel? I think about how peaceful our breakup was, how we didn't yell or accuse each other, how we both seemed to understand that it was time to move on. That kind of ending feels rare, and I didn't want to tarnish it by doing something that might come across as petty. But at the same time, I know myself. Keeping that door open, even just a crack, would make it harder for me to move forward. And then there's the question of how this decision might have affected her. I'm not naive. I know blocking someone can sting, even if it's not meant maliciously. Did I owe her more closure than I gave? Or was the act of ending things as calmly as we did enough? I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the relationship itself, the good, the bad, and the messy in between. It taught me a lot about myself, about what I want and don't want in a partner. But more than anything, it showed me the importance of setting boundaries, even if they're uncomfortable. So here's where I'm at. I did what I felt I had to do to take care of myself. Blocking her wasn't about revenge or bitterness, it was about protecting my peace. And yet, I can't ignore the nagging feeling that it might have been the wrong move. That's why I'm here asking you all, am I the bad guy for blocking my ex? Do you think it was an immature choice, or was it justified given everything we went through? I've shared my story honestly with all its flaws and contradictions. Now I want to know, what would you have done in my place? Am I the jerk here, or was this just the cleanest way to close the chapter?